Hi, my name is Sarah Connor, and I will be reading the Brothers Grimm version of Sleeping Beauty. Let's get this camera fixed a little better here. Alright. Once upon a time, there were a king and queen who were very unhappy because they had no children. But at last, a little daughter came along, and their sorrows were turned to joy. They rang the bells throughout the entire kingdom just to tell everybody of the glad tidings. The king had decided that he was going to throw a huge christening feast, so big that the likes of it had never been heard before. He invited all the fairies of the kingdom. There were 7 of them. He invited them to the christening, hoping that they would give their daughter a good gift. When the christening was over, it was time for the feast, and all the fairies were to sit in front of these plates with forks, spoons, and knives made of pure gold. But alas, in came down the hall an old fairy who was not invited. She hadn't been seen or heard from in over 50 years. The king ordered that at once a plate be brought to her, but she couldn't be given a gold plate like the rest of them, and so she got angry and she made mad comments and sat and muttered to herself. One of the younger fairies that sat next to her thought that she was being a little suspicious, so she was thinking that she might give a bad gift. So she hid behind a curtain so she could maybe relieve the bad gift that the older fairy was to give. At the end of the feast, the youngest fairy stepped up to give her gift to the child and said, "You will be the most beautiful woman in the world." The second said that she should have a temper as sweet as an angel. The third said that she should have wonderful grace in all that she said or did. The fourth said she shall sing as like a nightingale. The fifth said she shall dance like a flower in the wind. The sixth said she will play music so beautiful that the likes of it had never been heard. But then it was time for the old fairy to give her gift. And she stepped up next to the little girl, and she was shaking her head, and she said, "When the princess turns 17, she shall prick her finger with a spindle, and she shall die." The whole room shook. Everybody was muffled and terrified. Some of them even began to weep, but their sorrows were nothing compared to the king and queen's. Just then, the young fairy leaped out from behind the curtain and said, "Do not worry, king and queen. I cannot undo what my sister has done, but I can make it more pleasant." And she said that she will prick her finger on a spindle, but she will not die. She will instead just sleep for 100 years and then be awakened by a king's son. Immediately, all the fairies vanished. The king, trying to save his daughter, demanded that all the spindles be burned in the kingdom at once. But that did no good. One day, the king and queen left the princess in the kingdom by herself, and she wandered the castle when she came upon a small room. And when she looked inside, there was an old woman, a woman so old and so deaf that she never even heard the king say that all the spindles should be burned. So she was sitting there and spinning. The princess was like, "What are you doing, you good old woman?" And the old woman replied, "Well, I am spinning, my child." "Ah, can I try? How do you do it? Let me see if I can." And she no more than took it in her hands that she pricked her finger, fell down, and fell asleep. The old woman called out, and the people came in, but there was nothing that could be done. Once the young good fairy heard of this, she came rushing to the kingdom And she knew that the princess was going to sleep for 100 years, and she didn't want her to wake up alone. So she touched everybody in the kingdom with her magic wand to make them all go to sleep, besides the king and queen. She touched the ladies, the gentlemen, the pages, the waking maids, the footmen, the goodmen, the grooms in the stable, and even the horses. They all went to sleep where they were. The men were bowing to the ladies were embroidering, the grooms stood currying to their horses, and the cook was slapping the kitchen boy, but they were all stiff and asleep. The king and queen departed from the castle and gave orders that no one was to go near it, just in case. But that didn't matter either, as a tall wood grew in front of the castle and hid it from any man or beast that were likely to enter. A great many changes happened in those 100 years. The king and queen didn't have any other children, so the kingdom got passed on to another royal family. One day, the son of the king who had taken over that kingdom was out hunting, and he saw the towers above the giant dark wood, and he asked what they were, but nobody could answer him. Finally, an old peasant was found who said, "Your Highness, 50 years ago my father told me of a story of a young princess who is asleep in that castle, and she shall sleep there for 100 years until a king's son is to awaken her." The prince wasn't too sure what was going on, and he was determined to find out for himself. So he jumped off his horse and he started to go through the woods himself. To his surprise, the woods opened for him to go through, but they quickly shut behind him, and nobody else was allowed in. He joyously walked through the woods and came up to this beautiful castle, where he saw men and horses standing stiff like statues. But he wasn't afraid. He just kept on going. At last, the prince came to a gold chamber, and he opened the door, and in there laid a beautiful princess who looked like she had just fallen asleep. Almost trembling, he knelt down beside her and kissed her, and the spell was broken. And she woke up and she looked at him and she said, "Are you my prince? I have waited for you long." They were so happy. They talked and talked for hours and hours. And everybody else in the kingdom started to wake up and went back to the duties of what they were doing. The gentlemen were bowing. The women were embroidering. The grooms went on currying to the horses. The cook went on slapping the kitchen boy. But the chief lady came in and told him that supper was to be done, and they all went to the grand hall. The prince took the princess in his hand and led her there, and that night they were married. And the next morning the prince took the princess to his father's kingdom, where they lived happily ever after.